Hello and welcome. My name is Charles Buist and I'm a personal injury and wrongful death attorney. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about wrongful death lawsuits in South Carolina. Now, the bottom line is that if you have experienced the loss of a loved one due to someone else's negligence or recklessness, it's essential to understand the legal aspects involved in seeking justice. And that's what this video is all about. So let's get started. First off, let's talk about what constitutes wrongful death in South Carolina. Now, according to the South Carolina Code, wrongful death refers to a death caused by the wrongful act, neglect, or default of another person. Now, it's crucial to note that the act or omission leading to the death must be one that could have been the basis for a personal injury lawsuit if the deceased person had survived. Now, essentially, a wrongful death lawsuit in South Carolina can be thought of as a personal injury claim brought by the decedent's estate. And this makes sense, right? The victim of negligence can't bring a claim on behalf of himself or herself, and a negligent actor shouldn't get away with their wrongful act just because they killed the victim. So, wrongful death cases allow a family to hold the negligent or reckless actor liable. So let's talk about timing for a second. Time is of the essence when filing a wrongful death lawsuit, and understanding the statute of limitations is vital. In South Carolina, a wrongful death lawsuit must be filed within 3 years from the date of the deceased person's death. Now, this deadline is crucial because failing to file a claim can result in the loss of your legal right to seek compensation. So you lose the right to file the case. Now, let's explore who can legally bring a wrongful death lawsuit in South Carolina. So under South Carolina law, the estate administrator, also known as the executor or personal representative, is the individual entrusted with filing the lawsuit. Now, if the deceased person had a will, that document will typically designate the administrator. However, if the named administrator is unable or unwilling to serve, the court may appoint someone else to fulfill this role. Now, in cases where there is no will, the court will appoint an administrator. And this process can take several weeks or even months, depending on the circumstances. It moves very slow, okay? Now, once the court appoints an administrator of the estate, that administrator can file the wrongful death lawsuit on behalf of the deceased person's estate. Next, let's talk about who can benefit from a wrongful death lawsuit in South Carolina. In other words, who gets the money from the lawsuit? Now, the estate administrator, despite being responsible for filing the lawsuit, typically does not receive the benefits directly. Instead, the South Carolina Code specifies how the damages recovered in a wrongful death lawsuit are to be distributed. And these distributions typically occur as follows. First of all, the benefits would pass to the deceased person's spouse. And if there is no living spouse, then the benefits would pass to the deceased person's children. And if there are no living children and there is no living spouse, then the benefits would pass to the deceased person's parents. Finally, if they're not alive either, the money would pass to the deceased person's legal heirs, which would be determined by the statutes. Now, let's talk about the types of damages that can be recovered in a wrongful death lawsuit in South Carolina. So if the estate administrator settles or wins the lawsuit, the defendant will be required to provide monetary compensation to the estate. Now, the amount of damages awarded will depend on the type and severity of losses suffered. Generally, the recoverable damages may include things like funeral and burial expenses, medical bills and emergency room costs, lost wages due to the deceased person's inability to work, loss of support from the deceased person, both financially and emotionally. And other types of damages can include things like loss of knowledge and wisdom that the deceased person would have imparted, or the loss of companionship and care that would have been provided by the deceased person. And another type of damages that may be awarded is compensation for the pain and suffering endured by the family or by the deceased person between the time he or she suffered the fatal injuries and the time of death. Now, finally, punitive damages may be awarded in those circumstances where the defendant's behavior is deemed willful, wanton, or reckless. However, it's important to note that punitive damages are typically only allowed under specific circumstances as outlined by the South Carolina Code. So what are the key elements of a wrongful death lawsuit in South Carolina? Now, although it shares similarities with a personal injury claim, the key difference lies in who brings the claim. So the elements generally involve the same 4 elements of negligence that we'll see in any other personal injury case. And this includes duty, breach, causation, and damages. So let's start out with element number 1, duty. For this element, the plaintiff must prove by a preponderance of the evidence that the defendant owed the deceased person a duty of care. Now, this duty typically implies acting in a manner that a reasonable person would under similar circumstances. For example, in a trucking accident case, it might involve showing that the trucker had a duty to adhere to the rules of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Now, let's talk about the breach of duty. Here, the plaintiff must demonstrate that the defendant breached their duty of care toward the deceased person. For example, going back to trucking accident cases, the plaintiff may argue that the trucker breached their duty by driving too long without taking breaks as required by law. Next, let's talk about causation. To establish causation, the plaintiff must prove that the defendant's breach of duty was both the actual and proximate cause of the decedent's death. Now, the defendant may argue that other factors contributed to the death, attempting to kind of shift blame away from themselves. Finally, let's talk about the 4th element of negligence. We're talking about damages. Now, the presence of damages, such as injuries, lost wages, medical bills, and pain and suffering, is essential to establish a valid negligence claim. In the case of wrongful death, the most severe and heartbreaking type of injury has occurred. We're talking about the loss of a loved one. Well, that's all I have for you today. If you've lost a loved one as a result of another person or business's negligence or carelessness, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're happy to give you a free legal consultation and talk with you more about what happened. We handle wrongful death cases across South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina. And you can schedule your free consultation with us by calling us at the number below in the video description. Or you can look us up at www.carelessdeath.com. Thank you so much for watching this video, and we'll see you next time.